Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you are. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program tonight. It's our special Israel in Crisis briefing number 3. Thank you for your notes and donations in memory of David. The notes you've been writing have been really heartwarming to all of us, and we are passing all the notes on to the family. And thank you for your generous donations in his memory. The family will be informed of all of the donations. So thank you for that. And these continue to be very stressful times for Israel and for American Jewry and for many peoples beyond that. So we hope that by these programs and getting really great information from very knowledgeable people like Ambassador Dennis Ross, that we allay some anxiety and have just more education to be able to process what's going on. On behalf of our leadership team, Zev, Mel, Rabbi Chazen, and Caroline Kelly, I welcome tonight's guests, Ambassador Dennis Ross, as well as our outstanding moderator, Patt Morrison. Just want to remind you all, tomorrow we continue with our regular programming. We will welcome 2 scholars who specialize in issues of democracy and autocracy. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a history professor at NYU who specializes in fascism and autocracy. She will be in conversation with Larry Diamond of Stanford's Freeman Spogli School for International Studies. Larry, who's been on several times before, is a foremost scholar in the field of democracy studies. It will be an exceptional hour on a very important topic with 2 renowned scholars. As I said before we started the program, I hope you are all adjusting well to our new Zoom-based registration system. I still see there are some people having a difficult time with it. Don't use your iPads to register. But all the emails for getting into the program come directly from Zoom, no longer from Eventbrite and no longer from me, other than the registration link. You must register to be able to get the Zoom link. So now it is my honor to introduce an integral member of our team, Zev Yaroslavsky, to introduce tonight's guests. Zev?
Thank you, Janice. And I'm going to make the introductions brief so that we can have the maximum amount of time with Ambassador Ross. Dennis is not a stranger to our webinars. A senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, advised 3 presidents on Middle East policies and the peace process, in particular, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord. We couldn't ask for a more timely appearance of Dennis, and nobody has greater expertise in what's going on in the Middle East and the historical antecedents of the mess we're in now than Dennis Ross, Ambassador Dennis Ross. And he will be interviewed by Patt Morrison, a regular with us, a good friend, a Los Angeles Times columnist and reporter who shared in 2 Pulitzer Prizes, won 6 Emmys, multiple Golden Globes on television and radio, and one of our favorite interlocutors. So I'll turn it over to you, Pat and Dennis.
Thank you, Zev, very much. And those of you who watch us regularly will notice that there's a face missing. Our beloved co-founder, David Lehrer, died 2 weeks less a day ago. And if you are not in Los Angeles, maybe you don't know very much about David. There's a great deal about him online in the obituaries. I suggest you read them. David was a man of great heart, great conscience, and really a civic tentpole here for so many of us. I knew him for more than 30 years, and we're all missing him, his presence and his spirit, but this program will try to continue to fulfill what it is that he brought to it, the vision and the ideas he had originally. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for remembering him. Ambassador Ross, thank you for being here as well. You've been in Saudi Arabia. We last talked with you almost 3 weeks ago. It was a very different world then. Yeah. Public positions have changed. Israel saw enormous demonstrations in the capitals of the world in favor and support of Israel. Now we see a lot of demonstrations in favor and support of the Palestinians and even Hamas, and conflating the 2 of them. So maybe since this period, since the attacks and now, you can reset the table for us with the players, what's happening and what it looks like going forward.
Okay, well, look, thank you for posing the question that way, because it is a good way to think of where we are and how things have evolved over the course of 1 month. I do just want to say I didn't know David as well as many of you, but I did get to know him over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, and he was kind-hearted and very thoughtful, and even for someone who didn't have such a close relationship with him, I will miss him. In terms of where we are and how things have evolved, in a sense, what we've seen happen is Israel has launched basically a response against Hamas based on a premise. The premise was October 7th changed the world for Israel. When we think about Israel today, don't think that the Israel of October 6th is the same as Israel of October post-October 7th. November 7th is like a different Israel from what it was the last time I was on. When we talk about the context and what's happened internationally, we also have to understand that Israel is a different place. Israelis believe that they cannot live with Hamas next door, and this is a left to right phenomenon. They believe that everything that took place on October 7th was not just a shock and a trauma, but it was a reminder of who Hamas was in a way that maybe Israelis had, and maybe the rest of the world had not fully appreciated. It wasn't just the brutality, it was also torturing men, women, children, and celebrating in the torture. And that has kind of permeated the consciousness of Israelis. And the reason I say it is not just to create a context, but also to explain that the way Israel has attacked doesn't reflect the way it has before. In the past, when Israel was carrying out its attacks against Hamas, it would weigh each target. There might be enormous military value with the target, but if the civilian costs were seen as being too high, the balance was weighted towards not attacking as opposed to attacking. This time we've seen, with the way the bombing campaign has been conducted, that the balance or the calculus has shifted more towards, if the military target is of high value, even if there's going to be civilian consequences and civilian casualties, the balance of decision making has tilted towards, we need to take out that military target, because when this is over, Hamas cannot be in a position where it still can threaten Israel. And fundamentally, Hamas cannot be in a position where it still controls Gaza. When you hear some terms, people will say in Israel, annihilate Hamas. That's not the objective. The Israelis understand well, the IDF understands very well that you're not going to annihilate Hamas because it exists outside of Gaza. You're not going to get every single Hamas member or every single armed Hamas fighter. There is a sense, though, of attacking Hamas in a way that destroys its military wherewithal, attacking it in a way that destroys the organizational coherence of Hamas in Gaza, attacking it in a way that basically has it lose its command control. So the weight is put on these military targets, and we've seen what is a very high fatalities on the Palestinian side in Gaza, which reflects that decision-making process, but it also reflects another reality. Hamas has embedded itself in highly populated, dense populated areas. It puts its command control in ammunition sites, under schools, under hospitals, under mosques. It builds these extensive tunnels, which it uses to protect itself, but not the Palestinian public. And it wants the maximum number of Palestinians to be killed, because it believes that will shift the kind of pressure and actually lead Israel to being forced by the outside world, by the United States, to stop. It wants to stop Israel because that's the way it survives. The problem, of course, is as Israel proceeds with a campaign that produces very high civilian casualties, and we've seen high civilian casualties, it does shift the kind of balance of opinion. And we've seen it in this country. I can tell you, having just come back from the region, those images on all of the Arab satellite stations, especially Al Jazeera, have a searing effect. And it's the image of Palestinian casualties that affects the mindset and the emotions of Arab publics, and that affects the attitudes of Arab leaders who on the one hand want Hamas to lose, but on the other hand, feel the need to bring about a ceasefire without necessarily thinking, okay, does that lead to Hamas winning or does it lead to Hamas losing? And so we've seen a kind of shift take place. We see pressures on the Biden administration. The president has very much stood up in support of Israel, but you can also see the administration and the president are putting increasing pressure on Israel to take more account of the humanitarian needs. And I think the reality is Israel does need, if it wants to buy time and space to do more on the military side, it needs to demonstrate it's doing more to really try to limit Palestinian casualties and get more humanitarian assistance into Gaza.
But as far as we've seen with Ambassador Blinken or with Secretary of State Blinken, a lot of that has been rebuffed by Netanyahu and his administration. The last time you were here, you said it's important in Israel's interest to show they're fighting Hamas and not punishing the Palestinian people. It's an important distinction. It's one that's lost on a lot of people around the world. How is Israel doing in this?
Well, I think that for the first few weeks, we didn't see them make the kind of effort that I would have liked to see them make. Again, I think it's shaped by the shock and the trauma and the conviction that they have to be able to defeat Hamas. And again, to be fair, some of it is also based on the sense we don't have an endless amount of time. And that means you go after targets that really offer the biggest payoff in terms of military successes, even if it means there's going to be a price, a toll on the Palestinian civilians. And so, you know, would I have liked to see them do more? Yes, absolutely. As I said from the beginning, I understood that to have time and space, they were going to need to maximize what they were doing on the humanitarian issue. But I'll tell you again, the mood in Israel, and it's left to right, those who were the strongest peaceniks are just as convinced that Hamas has to be decisively defeated. And here's where there's a kind of tension, because the fact that all the hostages are being held, 240 were the number of hostages the Israelis have concluded were taken, of every age, including as young as 6 months. And the attitude within Israel is lifting the siege or allowing much more humanitarian assistance to go in shouldn't be done so long as the hostages are being held and there's no release of hostages. The problem is that in the end, that doesn't really affect Hamas. Hamas doesn't mind if Palestinians are suffering. It wants more of that because it sees more pressure being put on Israel. The idea that those in Israel who feel if we withhold this so that they understand they can get it only if they release the hostages, they're applying pressure on the people who have no control over whether or not hostages are going to be released. So you have it's a dilemma. I understand some of the pressures on the Israelis, but at the end of the day, if you want to have enough time to get the military job done, then you also are going to have to demonstrate you're doing much more to deal with the humanitarian needs of Palestinians. Now they're beginning to do it. They are beginning to do it.
There's a point that Robert asked us about this, and it reminds me sort of queasily of the American conundrum in Vietnam. It says, how does the IDF know who is Hamas and who's a Palestinian civilian?
Here, it's actually easier than you think. Most of the Hamas fighters are basically coming out of tunnels, and they are wearing, they're heavily armed. They wear a kind of uniform. This is not like Vietnam, where you really couldn't tell. You couldn't draw a distinction between the public and the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, especially the Viet Cong. Here, most of the fighters don't expose themselves. They come out of tunnels, or if they're, the Israelis will spot them in buildings. So it's the issue. The reason Palestinian civilians are exposed is because, again, most of the command positions, the military positions, are in heavily populated areas. Number one, Hamas has made a very determined effort to try to block people from leaving. The Israelis call for them to move to the south. In one case, we know that the Hamas actually fired mortars on Salah ad-Din Street, which is a main thoroughfare going north to south, to prevent those who are moving. They want to keep them as a kind of human shield. So it's more the bombing than the ground offensive that exposes the Palestinian civilians. Now, one of the problems there is this is a combined arms approach on the part of Israel. For the first couple of weeks, it was just the bombing, and that exposed the Palestinian civilians much more than anything else. In the last 10 days since the Israelis have been acting on the ground, they still call in strikes. They will identify a Hamas stronghold, or they'll identify what is an effort to ambush them. Either intelligence will get it, or Israeli spotters on the ground will get it. They will call in an airstrike or helicopters, and there may still be civilians who get killed as part of that. But the numbers are actually lower as it relates to the ground offensive than it does for bombing from the air.
Ambassador, as I pointed out, you just got back from Saudi Arabia, and the nations in the Mideast are not open. Like Egypt does not want Palestinians coming into Egypt in great numbers, and the fate of the Palestinians has always been a problem. You've got countries like Jordan where you have a lot of Palestinians, but where is the Muslim world and the Arab world? And I make that distinction because Iran is Muslim, but it is not Arab.
Right.
In terms of how it's deciding to sit back and see what's going to happen, where it chooses, if it chooses to apply any pressure at all. What's going on behind some of the pronouncements that we're seeing when it comes to these Muslim nations?
I think there's different layers to this. Hardly a surprise. In the Middle East, there's always multiple layers. On the one hand, there are some quiet discussions going on, mostly about how to bring this to an end. A little bit of discussion about what comes afterwards. What you're seeing for the most part is a quiet evolution. From the very beginning, what you had two Arab countries, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, who very quickly and explicitly condemned what Hamas did. Others condemned the killing of civilians, which was a way of acknowledging that this had happened in Israel, but it was still a more neutral way of doing it. It wasn't singling out Hamas. That was happening because there was an anticipation of how Israel was going to retaliate, and an expectation that there would be a lot of Palestinian civilian casualties. So there was a kind of positioning that was, trying to strike a balance. Some of the early discussions, I think, were based on how quickly can Israel get this done. There was a desire among many of the Arabs and even some of the Muslim countries, not Iran, but countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, to see this over. Hamas is not viewed in a positive way by almost any of the Sunni Arab governments. They see it as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood. They see it as, in many ways becoming, even though it's Sunni, an instrument of the Iranians. They define themselves as being part of what they call the axis of resistance. And so most of the Sunni Arab states view that as being threatening. But the real focus has been increasingly on, the need for a ceasefire, because they want to create calm among their publics. There are certain Arab states that worry about big demonstrations that may start off as demonstrations about the Palestinians, but turn into demonstrations against the regime. So there's a degree of anxiety about that, and there's obviously just a degree about wanting to calm an environment that it's understandable that this takes on a kind of life of its own. The Qataris who have maintained a relationship with Hamas, allow the political leaders of Hamas. I want to just make a point here. There is the political leadership of Hamas that is almost entirely outside of Gaza. There are the military leaders of Hamas who were the architects of October 7th. Sometimes the political leaders will make great claims about what they can deliver, and they're the ones who are sitting in Qatar, and it's not clear how much they want to convince the military leaders of Hamas to be responsive to releasing the hostages, how much they see the holding of the hostages as an important asset. I think I said the first time I was on a couple of weeks ago, Hamas took the hostages because they thought it would deter the Israelis or limit what the Israelis would do based on their own experience. Yahya Sinwar was one of those who was released in 2011 as part of 1,082 Palestinian prisoners being released for one Israeli, Gilad Shalit. So, there was a sense that people like Sinwar felt he knew the Israelis much better than the political leadership. He'd been a prisoner for 23 years. He's fluent in Hebrew. And by the way, the Israelis felt they knew him too. It turns out they really didn't. But anyway, I think just to get back to Qatar for a second, Qatar has been making an effort to get the hostages released. I don't know if there was at one point a proposal to actually release the hostages and have the Hamas leadership leave Gaza, a little bit like in 1982 when Yasser Arafat, after the siege of Beirut, he and the PLO fighters left Lebanon and went to Tunisia. I think at one point, Qatar might have proposed that or at least raised it. It didn't go anyplace. And honestly, it didn't surprise me. The Sinwar and Marwan Issa and Mohammed Daif, who were the real architects of what happened on October 7th, they come from the Izzedim al-Qassam brigade in Gaza. They are true believers. And for them to leave, it would be looking like they weren't prepared. They were prepared to leave themselves and sacrifice everyone else who were the fighters. So it doesn't surprise me that if that proposal was raised, and I don't want to push it too much, I'm not surprised it didn't go very far.
With the Biden administration has been in a bit of a vice. Certainly domestically, it's been getting some pressure from other Democrats to pressure Netanyahu for a ceasefire or a pause, and I'll ask you about the distinction shortly.
Yeah.
But also there's pressure from what it can or cannot do, what kind of voice or influence it has with Netanyahu, and how it can play all of these interests off with the other countries in the Mideast and with the U.S. allies who, up to a point, had gone along with Biden and with Israel.
Look, I think you put your finger on something that reflects the challenges that the administration is facing. And I would even say that the president has an emotional reaction to what happened on October 7th because of this deep emotional bond that he feels with Israel. He's not at all indifferent to the cost, the toll that's being imposed on Palestinians, but he shares the same basic premise that Israel should not have to live again facing the threat from Hamas. Ghazi Hamad, who has always been portrayed as one of the moderate Hamas officials, said, "We will do October 7th again and again and again." And that sort of validates the Israeli view. We can't live with them, and it sort of reinforces the president's attitude that the Israelis shouldn't have to live with that. But he's also trying to balance, not doing this, not having the Israelis do it in a way that imposes such a terrible price on the Palestinians that you lose others who should be supportive of this basic Israeli goal. So far the Europeans have stayed pretty steady in terms of sticking with Israel and supporting the Biden position on this. But we've seen now the foreign minister of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, has come out and he's called for a ceasefire. And clearly that's the attitude. When Secretary of State Blinken over the weekend was in Amman and he met with the foreign ministers of Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and the Secretary General of the PLO, he got an earful on the need for an immediate ceasefire. So you have an administration that's trying to balance conflicting pressures while also trying to be true to an objective that ends with Hamas no longer in control of Gaza and not in a position to be threatening Israel. And trying to reconcile this is extremely difficult. I still think what you see, the administration is trying to create space for Israel, but it's requiring more from Israel on the humanitarian issue to be able to do that. And you're right that there's been a public kind of rebuff of the request for a pause. And I want to, you said you're going to pose the question, so I'll preempt your
Please do.
question. The difference between a ceasefire is basically you're bringing this to an end. You had a ceasefire in 2009. You had a ceasefire in 2012. You had a ceasefire after 2014, where it went on for 52 days. There's a ceasefire in 2021. In all these cases, that ended what were the conflict, the hostilities at that moment. And in all these cases, Hamas was able to recoup and rebuild itself, notwithstanding the fact that Israel had a blockade, which tells you something about the limits of the blockade. So a ceasefire means you just basically go back and you act as if October 7th never happened. You treat it like every previous one of these conflicts. Even if the Israelis are isolated, they're not going to let that be the result. So a temporary pause is different. Temporary pause, in lots of different conflicts, you'll see a 12-hour pause to allow humanitarian assistance to be delivered, or a 10-hour pause to permit people to move along corridors that can remain safe. The Israelis yesterday allowed a 3-hour pause for Palestinians to move from the north to the south. So they also allowed Jordan to fly in and do an airdrop of humanitarian assistance. They're allowing the UAE now to set up a field hospital as well. So you're beginning to see the effect of the administration's efforts on Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government. I think they're going to press for more, and I think they will continue to press for, and this, as I said, becomes easier when you're part of the ground campaign, because the bombing isn't going to be the same as it was during the preceding period. I think the administration wants to show it's having a difference, not only for the region, not only for our air partners, but for the domestic audience here as well.
Let me synthesize a number of questions.
Pat,
I beg your pardon. Let me synthesize a number of questions we're getting about how effective this campaign by Israel can be. How effective can it be to wipe out Hamas? A good portion of Hamas may not even be in Gaza right now. Would it radicalize a new generation just of Palestinians, never mind what it's doing in the rest of the region? So what does that victory look like? How does Israel count it and say, all right, mission accomplished? I know an unfortunate choice of phrase given its history in this country, but essentially that's what it amounts to.
Look, it's an excellent question, because at some point, Israel will have to define that it has achieved what its mission was. I was saying before, this is not wiping out Hamas. It's not doing that. That's not the aim. The aim is much more geared towards ensuring that Hamas doesn't have the military wherewithal and that infrastructure, which is also a very embedded infrastructure in terms of tunnels, but it's not. They have bomb-making labs. They have rocket-making labs. They have mortar-making labs. They have a variety of training facilities. All that they want to be able to destroy, and that is probably achievable. They have all sorts of compounds. The Israelis have seized a number of compounds where they have, in a mosque today, they took over a compound that was under a mosque. It had 50 rockets in it. There was a boys' club that they took over as well. It had another 50 rockets in it. So there are all sorts of arms caches everywhere. There are all sorts of compounds. They're seizing intelligence. They're seizing plans. They're seizing they've destroyed a number of the tunnels now. So they want to put themselves in a position where militarily, Hamas basically has lost the wherewithal. You'll see, by the way, the numbers of rockets being fired into Israel now down very dramatically. There'll still be alerts during the day, but the numbers, yesterday they had close to 12 hours with no alerts. So they're increasingly in a position where Hamas is finding it harder and harder to be able to fire rockets. It hasn't ended yet, but that's also a sign that they are making more progress on the ground. The key, I think, here is not just the military, but also are they in a position where Hamas basically loses the ability to command and control and operate as an organization? And so much of what they're going after is a lot of the leadership, the commanders of all the brigades, the battalions. And here again, they have data, they have face recognition data on, thousands of Hamas fighters. So this is a very different kind of operation. You hear people say, look, it's like Fallujah. Well, actually, it's not like Fallujah, because Fallujah was 6,000 miles from here. This is right next door. Israel actually has a lot of experience engaging in this kind of warfare in Gaza in the past, certainly in the West Bank. The question is, and this is something that I would like to see Israel do that they're not doing with us. I'd like to see them I'd like to see them do it quietly with a number of the Arab leaders, go through and explain, here's what the military objective is, here's where we are in terms of what we knew we had to be able to destroy. Here's where we are in terms of disrupting and basically undermining the command control. Here's where we are in terms of identifying and being able to decimate the leadership there. The issue of radicalizing the public, I would just note one thing. In the 52 days in 2014, there was a lot of destruction. There were something like 3,000 buildings that were destroyed in 2014. There wasn't 10,000 Palestinians who were killed, but there were about 3,000 who were killed. When Palestinians went the end of that, after 52 days, they were angry at Israel, but they were angry at Hamas for subjecting them to this. I think it raises an important question. What's interesting to me is that both the Israelis and the Arabs are focused on what's happening right now and not so much the day after. It's as if both sides are counting on the US to come in with a day after plan. And it may be that we are the ones who will have to come in with a day after plan. That day after plan has to create an alternative administration, an interim administration in Gaza. It needs very rapid reconstruction of infrastructure as a way of showing when Hamas is not in control, life changes dramatically for the better. And that can change, I think, the reality in Gaza and the psychology. One caveat, Hamas has been socializing and educating people from the age of 3. So there's there's an ethos there that has been socialized as well, but it's not the majority of the Gazans. There was a poll beforehand. I don't remember if I said this the first time I was on, but 62% of Palestinians in Gaza did not want Hamas to break the ceasefire. What I mentioned before, I think Whispers in Gaza, the people who are responsible for that are still talking to people in Gaza and are putting up some of these interviews now. Again, that people there want this to end. So, the longer this goes on, does it create the potential for radicalization? It does, especially if you leave a vacuum. If Israel can't do this and then just withdraw and leave a vacuum. So Israel will need to have a way to get out. But I would like to see Israel do a number of things in addition to the humanitarian issues. I'd like Israel to announce very clearly, we're not staying, we will get out. 1, 2, we are not trying to drive Palestinians out of Gaza. 3, we will not keep any territory in Gaza when this is over. 4, the blockade, when Hamas is no longer in power, the blockade that we've had on since 2007, we will lift.
It still does bring in historical lessons. We think of what happened in Afghanistan, the American effort to rebuild schools and institutions, and yet that small number of Taliban managed to destabilize it. The same thing in Iraq with ISIS. Are these lessons that we're going to learn from if essentially Gaza has to be rebuilt from the bottom up?
I do think it's different in one very important respect. People tend to forget the highest per capita number of advanced degrees in the Arab world is among Palestinians. This is an educated population in Gaza. And there are technicians there, technical people. It's not like Afghanistan, that was dramatically less developed. There is a potential here for rebuilding. Ironically, because of the small size of Gaza, the potential for rebuilding it, and fairly rapidly, in relative terms, $10 billion would go very far towards rebuilding Gaza. When we talk about rebuilding Syria, where you had 600,000 dead, it's about $400 billion. This is not like that. And so, look, I don't want to suggest this is simple, but it's not quite the same as what we've seen in other places. This is not a public that was as radicalized, as part of Iraq was because of the effect of us going in.
Whose billions of dollars are these, Ambassador?
I do believe we're going to see the Gulf states contribute in a significant way. I think the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and I would say especially the Qataris, they've maintained this relationship with Hamas. They have helped to bankroll Hamas. Now they need to shift and focus and help rebuild Gaza that Hamas has done so much to contribute to its destruction.
Let's bring in some more of the questions from you who are watching there. Stuart wants to know, does the United States have sufficient leverage to compel Netanyahu to agree to a two-state solution in exchange for guarantees of Israel's security? We're looking at the fate of the two-state solution here.
I think the answer on that is no. But I think you also have to take a step back. Again, the people who are the most pronounced peaceniks in Israel are not talking about concessions to the Palestinians right now. One of the things we have to realize is the nature of the trauma in Israel has riveted Israel on the immediate task at hand. There will be a political reckoning in Israel. It will come. And there will be a debate over relations with Palestinians. It will come. But the emotionally processing what has happened also has to take place in Israel. Pressing the Israelis now for two states at a time when they're still reeling from what's happened is going to produce a backlash, including from those who would be your natural allies in Israel. You have to let this process play itself out. You have to get beyond where we are. There will be a political reckoning, and there will be a debate on the relations with the Palestinians, which honestly has never taken place. Oslo was a secret process. And when it was unveiled by Prime Minister Rabin, he had a lot of opposition. There wasn't a debate about it because it was basically adopted. When the interim agreement was passed, it was passed 61-59. The opposition was reflexively against it. The government made the case for it, but you didn't have this underlying debate about, well, what should the relations with the Palestinians be? The peace camp was killed in Israel by the Second Intifada. Since that time, there's been literally nobody has been in a prominent political position and has sort of been able to say, look, we need to sit down, we need to have a discussion. What kind of relationship do we need to have with the Palestinians? And that is going to come, and it will have different schools of thought. There will be those who say we couldn't possibly afford a Palestinian state because what if a Hamas-like group comes to take it over? But you'll have others who will say, we've just defeated Hamas. Anybody who thinks that you can freeze the relationship with Palestinians on exclusively our terms and you won't radicalize the Palestinians so we don't face a successor to Hamas, you're in a dream world. That's coming, but it's not happening right now.
So how can Israel monitor for its own safety, if nothing else, a newly constituted Gaza without that sense of occupation that is such a trigger word?
Because Israel doesn't want to stay, the key becomes, can you create an interim administration, a transitional administration under an international umbrella. I would prefer a UN mandate that creates a civil administration, a security presence in force, and creates a basis for reconstruction based on demilitarization and the monitoring of all materials that come in, so you know how they're being used and what the end use is. If this is done in a credible way, the Israelis will be able to accept it. Now, in a credible way, when I say UN mandate, if this is an American initiative to try to get it to the Security Council, you can guarantee that Putin will veto it. But if it's a Saudi-led Arab initiative, he will not veto it. He values his relationship with the Saudis. The Saudis, here's one of there are certain kinds of tensions and objectives right now. One is this issue of you got to defeat Hamas versus the idea of an immediate ceasefire. The other is, my sense now from not just the Saudis, but others, is they are prepared to play a different role. For the last couple of years, I've been trying to convince the administration and different Arab leaderships that there really needs to be reform of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It's lost its legitimacy because it's terrible governance and corruption, and you needed to have a newly empowered prime minister, much like Salam Fayyad in 2007, who comes in and cleans it up. I'm now hearing a very different set of attitudes about, okay, there needs to be reform there, and we are prepared to play a role, which they weren't prepared to before. They want that because they want to see the PA get back into Gaza after some sort of transitional period. But when they say, look, we'll play this role, we'll help support this transitional period in Gaza, we'll contribute to the reconstruction in Gaza, but we don't want to deal with it in isolation. A word I was consistently hearing was there has to be a holistic approach, meaning, yes, transition in Gaza, yes, reform in the West Bank, but also a political horizon that ends with two states. So here, what I was just saying about the Israelis have to process this, and what you're seeing on the Arab side, if you want us to play a role, we have to see there's a real political horizon that two states is absolutely on the agenda. And so here again, you got to kind of bridge these two positions. And, it means, in my mind, we can get back to it, but we have to be smart about the way we go about it. We have to make it clear that, there's a precondition for being able to get to two states, which, by the way, is a fact. If you don't defeat Hamas, there is no possibility for peace, because you're going to end up with the ideology of rejection will be given an enormous boost. If you defeat Hamas, then you've taken away one of the instruments of Iran. You've taken away one of the critical players that has opposed all moves towards peace, and it puts you in a different place. But it also requires us, at least we, and you've heard President Biden talk about two states now, you're hearing Secretary Blinken talk about two states now, we have to begin to frame this in a way that makes it clear that's the direction we're going. The Israelis, you can't impose it on them, but you can help them adjust to this reality as they themselves go through this process of trying to completely come to grips with what happened on October 7th.
Wendy, one of our viewers wants to know about any underground resistance by Palestinians to Hamas, something that might be even enough of a critical mass to aid in the process you're talking about.
Hamas has been so good at literally chopping off the head of anybody who raises it up in opposition. There were demonstrations. People didn't realize a couple months ago, there were demonstrations in Gaza against the economic conditions, and they were very brutally and very rapidly put down. Anybody who raises any dissent was immediately either arrested, or in some cases, they didn't live to tell the tale. So it's they have the instruments of coercion. I think it is possible if you create this transitional arrangement. I mean, if you take a look, for example, there is precedent for it. After the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, there was a UN mandate for what was a transitional administration that actually brought in outside administrators. Actually, the head of the new administration was actually from Japan, but they brought in a significant military force as well. I would like to do it differently in Gaza. I would like to have that international umbrella. I'd like to have that UN mandate, but I'd like Palestinian technocrats to be the ones who run the administration. I would like to see a mix of security forces from the region and outside the region. I would like to see those who have experience in post-conflict situations with reconstruction, like the Canadians, come in to help manage that process. I would like to do it that way. It's not, I don't see Cambodia as a model. I see it as an interesting precedent in terms of building a credible transition administration and with the UN mandate, but I'd like to construct it somewhat differently.
We saw an apropos of a question from, let me see if I can find it, Barbara, about Israel and Hamas and the international support for Ukraine. We've already seen the Republican leadership in Congress want to divide support from Israel from the support for Ukraine. And we've also seen Putin meet with Hamas. So what is the strategy from Putin's point of view? We have Russia with a veto on the United Nations Security Council. Putin obviously seeing some advantage to be parlayed here, or he wouldn't have done this in the first place.
Let's look at his motivation. His motivation is the expand this war. We want to prevent an expansion of the war. That's why we've deployed the kind of forces to the region and signaled Iran and signaled Hezbollah, don't play with fire. He wants to do exactly the opposite. But that's not where China is. China doesn't want to see a region-wide war. And Iran is much more dependent on China than it is on the Russians. Quite the opposite. The Russians depend on the Iranians. He wants to divert attention away from what's going on in Ukraine. He wants to make it harder for us to continue to support Ukraine. And he sees there's a division among Republicans. It's less division between Republicans and Democrats than it's division among Republicans. You look at the Senate Republicans, they're much more prepared to go ahead and support what is both the supplemental that the president was asking for both Israel and Ukraine. It's the House Republicans that have been unwilling to do that. Putin, of course, sees those differences, and he hopes to win a war of attrition, and he hopes that we will stop supporting Ukraine or basically grow weary of it. He hopes the Europeans will as well. His only chance of success is that. So he sees this war as a great opportunity. Not a surprise that he's promoting Hamas. He wants this to, create problems for the United States. He wants it to divert our attention. He's not interested in Israel winning. On the other hand, he's someone who does pay attention to power.
A lot of questions are being posed about the day after in Israel itself. And it may be cynical to suggest that the longer the war goes on, the longer Netanyahu's own reckoning for the consequences of this is put off, the longer he stays in power.
Yeah.
Look down the road to that day, would you?
Look, I look at what the reaction was to 1973, the Yom Kippur War. You had the Argonaut Commission. It formed after the end of the war, ended the end of October. It issued its report in March. It only called for the resignation of the head of the military, chief of staff of the military, and the head of military intelligence. It did not call for the resignation of the prime minister or the defense minister. Tens of thousands of reservists hit the streets and demanded they resign. To think that you'll have the darkest day in Israel's history, dramatically worse than the 73 war. Because the 73 war, it touched the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Didn't touch Israel proper. This was first time in Israel's history, really since the War of Independence, where Israel lost territory and had to regain it within Israel. And it suffered grievous losses. Forget the brutality and the torture and so forth. This was something it never experienced before. The idea that it's going to be only the military and the intelligence and not the political echelon that will pay a price really strains the bounds of credulity. So there'll be a political reckoning for sure. Exactly what it looked like, I don't know, but it's coming. And I think you have to let it play out. Israel is a democracy where there is accountability. And it's to expect that this won't happen. We saw from January to October 6th, we saw 40 weeks of demonstrations, big demonstrations by Israelis who felt their democratic identity was being threatened. There will be that impulse is going to be magnified because of the shock of this, and also just the level of heroism on that day. The number of Hamas that came in was 3,000. You had small groups of Israelis, people who were military units didn't go down there. Small segments of it went down there. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet the level of heroism actually reduced what would have been a much worse toll than the one that we even saw. So they're all going to say, how did this happen? It's coming.
Well, Ambassador, given the intelligence failures, how reliable is the information that Israel and the IDF have about who in Gaza is Hamas and who isn't? Because I think that that's a perennial question that's emerged about who the targets are, the human targets, not the infrastructure targets.
But here I'd say it's really two very different levels of intelligence realities here. This intelligence failure was based on an assumption. The assumption was that Yahya Sinwar had no interest in a conflict with Israel, and therefore everything that was taking place was interpreted through a prism. The difference between intelligence analysis based on assumptions and technical intelligence, Israel has, I was saying this before, because of facial recognition, Israel has a roster of several thousand of the Hamas fighters. That's technical intelligence. That kind of stuff is different than, do you make an assumption about what their intentions are and what they're going to do? This is identifying who are the fighters. They know every battalion, every brigade. They know the leaders of each of those battalions and the brigades. They can give you chapter and verse on who they are and what their history was. They know that many of these were were released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal. So the technical intelligence was always very good. It was the analytical side of this and the assumptions that were made that produced such a colossal intelligence failure.
So many of our viewers wonder what is likely to happen to the hostages. You talk about a different attitude, maybe a different policy in Israel than the one soldier for whom 1,000 some Palestinians were exchanged. This is a different set of circumstances, and in many ways a much harder one emotionally and perhaps tactically as well.
Look, it is. I have spoken about what are excruciating dilemmas and choices that have to be made. Nothing is more excruciating than the issue of the hostages. Deeply felt in Israel. I have a suspicion that the Qataris will end up succeeding in getting some broader releases. I don't know this, but I have a suspicion that Bill Burns our CIA director was just in Israel, and now he's on his way to Qatar. Now, maybe I'm putting one and one together and not coming up with the right answer, but the fact that he's going to Qatar suggests to me that this is about the hostages, and maybe trying to influence Hamas as well. But I think this is about the hostages, and I suspect we'll see something. But a deal where all the hostages are released is highly unlikely. Hamas was basically trying to negotiate for releasing some hostages in return for the Israelis, taking certain steps like providing fuel, as an example, which of course Hamas has plenty of. But fuel is an issue, obviously, for the hospitals. And so, they were saying, okay, we want something. We don't release hostages unless we get something for it. And they were pressing they wanted prisoners released to release the hostages. So I think my guess is Qatar has put pressure on them. Partly, Qatar's in a position where with us, it needs to justify, okay, you have this relationship with Hamas. We're trying to see what benefit, you claim it has benefits. We're seeing no indication of that. But I wonder whether, as I said, the Burns trip is related to the hostages. I may be wrong about this, but that's the way it feels to me.
Does Israel need to prepare its people for the possibility that the hostages will never come back?
It's a really hard thing to do. First of all, to look the families in the face and say they're not coming back, it's a very hard thing to do. The families are saying you have to make every effort. The government is saying we're making every effort. But I've said throughout, there's tension in objectives. Ceasefire versus defeating Hamas. Creating a political horizon with two states at a time when the Israelis aren't yet processing that. You have a set of military objectives. The danger to a lot of the hostages, especially, you can assume they're probably being held in the most sensitive places that are the most important to Hamas basically as a form of protection. So, what happens if there are rescue operations? We know that one of the hostages was rescued by the Israelis. The track record on rescue operations is mixed in terms of you clearly succeed in getting some saved, but not others.
Even in Entebbe, says that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Entebbe was a great success, but I remember when I was in 1994, Colonel Waxman was kidnapped, and Rabin asked me to go to Arafat because he thought he was kidnapped to Gaza, and Arafat said he's not in Gaza, and it turned out he was in East Jerusalem, and the Israelis launched a rescue operation, and it failed. I mean, they stormed the site, but he got killed, you do these rescue operations when you have the intelligence, when you think you have a shot, but also when you think there's a danger that if you don't do it, the hostages are going to be killed anyway. So look, I said excruciating is the right word, and you hate to be the person who has to make these choices.
Ambassador, our late co-founder, David Lehrer, was an indefatigable optimist, and he asked, as you may remember, after every session, that we wind up with something positive and something hopeful. So if you could give us a minute of that, I think many people would look forward to having something to hold on to.
Well, you're doing this at a time that is probably one of the greatest challenges for me, because this is a very tough situation. But I do think if Hamas loses control in Gaza, what that really means is they're too weak to prevent a new administration from coming in. If that's the outcome, I really do think we have a potential to transform Gaza, but I also think we can get back to the Saudi normalization with Israel, which will have to have a Palestinian component. It will be more serious than it might have been before. And that gives me a sense of real possibility. So I'm trying to address David even when he's not here.
Ambassador Ross, thank you. I hope you'll come back again, because you make so much of this so clear for us, and we're very grateful.
Thank you. Always good to be with you.
Ambassador Dennis Ross has joined us. Please join us again tomorrow for our regular Wednesday program to find out more about these situations as they are sorted out when we talk about strongmen and autocrats today, a topic very much uppermost in mind in current circumstances and the future. Thank you all for watching us, for joining us, and for supporting this program, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.